Thank you for having me. Let's be back here this second time here at Austin. Today I'll talk about geopolitical rivalry in the digital age in this generated inventions. I'm sort of in the very beginning stages of kind of looking at some ideas for the book project. So this will be helpful me hear some reactions, test out some arguments and ideas in the course of the next 30 or 40 minutes before we kind of open up for Q&A. So let me start over here. So I want to start with a story, which is that in the early morning of May of this year, May 3rd, two drones, spaced 16 minutes apart, penetrated Russian airspace and flew towards Moscow. The target was a Kremlin residence of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The first drone approached from the west, exploded into the dome, Kremlin's Senate House building at 2:27 a.m. A second drone came from the east and detonated near a flagpole on top of the same dome at 2:43 a.m. At least one of the explosions caused a brief fire that workers had to scramble to put out. Video showed anti-aircraft fire shooting over the Kremlin's Golden Dome churches. Fortunately for Putin, he was sleeping in a compound 20 miles to the west of Moscow. But despite Russian attempts to downplay the attack, clearly state authorities were rattled. The strike was so brazen that some experts initially doubted whether Ukraine at all was capable of pulling it off. And many speculated that this was a false flag attack planned by the Russians. But it soon became apparent that not only did Ukraine launch the attack, but it had developed a long-range drone program largely on its own. Over the year, multiple groups came together and raced to assemble a long-range drone that could strike targets hundreds of miles away. What started as a pleasant effort is now more into a billion-dollar enterprise. What do we make of Ukraine's ability to strike at the heart of Russian power? I think first it's a clarifying lesson in the new age of global tech competition. Big states no longer have a monopoly on advanced technology and innovation, and that tech expertise is diffusing around the world. Smaller states with the right engineers and programmers can develop sophisticated tools to challenge much larger rivals. Well, let's go to the second. So, while Ukraine was building a homegrown drone industry, Russia was forced to turn to an unlikely partner for help, Iran. Now, Russia has been running out of precision missiles and even basic ammunition. Reportedly, the military has been buying 4-year-old stockpiles with war. Russia had not invested in a domestic drone industry, so it was lacking the means to sustain attacks against Ukrainian cities. In a sign of desperation, Putin placed an order for 2,400 Iranian Shahed kamikaze drones before the attack of Ukrainian cities. Russia also used to do in Iran to build a drone factory, pictured right here in Russia's Feldstein region, with a goal to manufacture 6,000 drones per year using Iranian expertise and design. So this, I think, highlights another novel aspect of the competition over technology. As innovation diffuses around the world, big powers often have to turn to smaller debates for technological help. So I guess the question kind of underlying my talk today is how is global competition over technology shaping geopolitics? And the argument I'm going to make is that what matters is which countries or organizations can access disruptive technologies, AI systems, autonomous drones, to satellite internet technology and advanced semiconductors, and which cannot. Those who lack these tools struggle to compete with rivals, struggle to acquire economic leverage, and struggle to project power. And so I think, an important part of the story really is the digital power of the West. So I think the Western states benefited from leading and setting rules on innovation, tech standards, and export regulations. And that really harkens back to me and to a large extent to the 20th century, when U.S. government public funding supported major tech innovations using geopolitical and military advantage. It helped the United States prevail in the Cold War, and it facilitated America's emergence as a preeminent global power. But I think the dynamics today are pivotal, and I think challenging U.S. and Western dominance for 3 reasons. I think the first reason relates to commercialization and the diffusion of technology. So commercialization makes it difficult for large states to control the spread of the data process. In the past, technological breakthroughs, so look at the internet, the GPS, nanotechnology, were by and large funded by the U.S. government and only later commercialized by private companies. Most national security technology do not have widespread commercial application. But with the end of the Cold War, this dynamic was shifted. Now, tech innovations are increasingly dual use, possessing civilian and military applications. And new technologies are more likely to be generated with private sectors, financing private capital, and market clients around the world. So accordingly, companies have shifted priorities. They're focusing less attention on governments and militaries. And this loss of control means that larger governments have a diminished ability to determine how companies will develop technologies, including those with military applications. So a case in point, and one I'll talk about a little later, is Starlink. I think a second dynamic after the commercialization of technology is authoritarian convergence with China and Russia seeking alternatives. So as the West is tightening restrictions against China and Russia, Putin and Xi have drawn steadily closer. This is a picture from a March 2023 trip where Xi traveled to Moscow. This occurred just after the International Criminal Court had issued an arrest warrant against Putin for war crimes. Both leaders declared in this meeting, after the war crimes indictment had come out, that relations were the strongest they had ever been. There's a good quote from Evan Ostos in the New Yorker. Quote, last weekend, for a farewell to the glory of the president, she told Putin, right now they're changing the life that we have seen for 100 years. And we are the ones driving this change. Yeah, Putin responded, I agree. So while China and Russia and Iran remain reliant on Western technology for now, they are looking to break their dependencies. This is playing out in three interesting ways. So for Russia, Western sanctions have forced Putin to find creative ways to get needed parts for the war effort. So, for example, if you look at the latest tanks, they require complex electronics and even basic kamikaze drones with microchips to function properly to evade Ukrainian air defenses. Moreover, Russia's semiconductor industry is a mess. It's been plagued by disinvestment, suffocated by export controls. It operates at 65 nanometer chip technology. It was 15 years behind the United States. But Russia has come up with alternatives. After experiencing a steep drop in the import of transistors and microprocessors in 2022, its supplies have actually rebounded to pre-war level. How has it done so? In part, this is due to Russia's deft use of parallel import supply chains, which have allowed Moscow to obtain 98% of its component via third country instead of direct import. Iran has actually proven to be a major, to be an important partner in this process. Not only investing in joint drone production facilities with Russia, but also assisting sanctions evasion by setting up new transit infrastructure, leveraging and trade routes. China has stepped in as well. In the fourth quarter of 2022 alone, China accounted for 87% of Russia's semiconductor imports. And most of the imports are not even Chinese made. A lot of them originate from Western companies and come from transition via Hong Kong and Chinese shell companies. So we call that mechanism to allow Russian movement to stay afloat. We give them months of short-term conflict. But China has also felt in October 2022, and more recently in October this year, the U.S. has implemented export restrictions that have laid bare China's vulnerabilities. So the bulk of the chips powering its projects and institutions remain tied to American technology. And while China has spent billions developing its domestic capability, its efforts are still falling short. In 2020, for example, China's domestic chip manufacturers supplied less than 60% of the country's overall demand for chips. And it's recently in April 2023, China spent more money importing semiconductors than oil. In the near-term term, the West's export restrictions have thrown Chinese industry for a loop. But like the Russians, Beijing is also developing substitutes. Chinese firms are circumventing sanctions by purchasing semiconductors from other subsidiaries and acquiring microchips from underground markets. Reportedly, NVIDIA's A100 artificial intelligence chips, for example, can be purchased for $20,000 a piece in transactions, with roughly double the rate of price today's cost. And restrictions have spurred Chinese companies to double their efforts to produce higher-end chips as well. So just in August, Huawei introduced a smartphone powered by an advanced 7-nanometer microprocessor that's only produced by Chinese chip manufacturers, SMIC. So while 7-nanometer chips are still some distance from the leading edge, the gap between China and the West has shrunk. But now the third dynamic, so one, we're looking at commercialization of the region. Two, authoritarian convergence. The third dynamic is emerging states which are leveraging technology to advance geopolitical interests. So countries like Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey see larger influence in a competitive global environment. And while they're not looking to supplant great powers, these leaders desire to chart an independent path and gain a greater voice in the international system. And they use technology as a key to enhancing the power. As such, they are devoting significant resources to building up private industries to secure commercial and technological advantage. I have written an article that's forthcoming in the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs that looks specifically at the issue in relation to drones. And what I concluded in the article through my research is that military use of drones is surging worldwide, and increasing demand for drone exports are being produced by middle power states, particularly Iran, Israel, and Turkey. And while Israel has a long-standing drone industry, Iran and Turkey are newer entrants. So why are drone exports to middle power states expanding so rapidly at the cost of drone exports from traditional larger states? Well, the argument I make in the article is that one, cost efficiency. So it costs $20,000 approximately to purchase a Shahed, Iranian Shahed kamikaze. About $1 to $2 million to purchase a Bayraktar TB2 drone from Turkey. It costs tens of millions for U.S. equipments like Repression. Number two, the drones being produced by middle powers have improved capabilities. So many of them are able to sustain high altitude flight. They have sensors for laser targeting. They have a range of customizable options. And what we've seen empirically is that Turkey's TB2 drones are adept to fighting regional war, particularly against inferior opponents with weak air defense systems where they can ship without the ground. We only have to look at conflicts like Ethiopia, Tigray, or Nagorno-Karabakh to see how that has manifested. And then finally, there are minimal technical controls that middle powers face when it comes to who can purchase these items and who cannot, as compared to exports that come from countries like the United States, which are controlled by the missile technology field. And so these exports have allowed Iran, Israel, and Turkey to enhance the political leverage and increase the geopolitical clout. So what's the data show? Well, right here, this was again broken down in the article in a couple of weeks. You can see I got data from SIPRI's Arms Transfer Database from 2023. And what it shows there is the leading exporters of military grade drones by numbers of orders. And I think what's interesting is that Turkey industry, for example, which you can see in the red, as recently as 2017, it was essentially a minimal play and exported very little. But by 2021, it had registered 66 global orders, and each order, could be anywhere from 10, 50, or 100 TB2 drones. 67 orders in 2022, and now is trailing only the United States as the most prolific international supplier of military-grade UAVs. So, this to me tells a really important story. And that when we think of exports of high technology items, we think of them primarily coming from a few countries, Russia, China, the United States, maybe other countries in Europe, when in fact, we're seeing that shift. And because of that shift, there are major implications when it comes to the distribution of geopolitical power, and also when it comes to, I think, a few of technical considerations as well. So I want just to delve a little more deeply into Turkey in terms of how it's developed its drone industry. So, one of the kind of leading companies is Baykar, and it's a brainchild of Selçuk Bayraktar. He's a 44-year-old CTO of the company. And he cuts a swashbuckling figure, and is a celebrity Turkey that many compare him to Elon Musk. His rise, I think, really mirrors Turkey's own ascension as a regional power. While he was completing his graduate coursework at UPenn and at MIT, he began building prototypes, drones, and family plans. It would take him 10 years to perfect a model suitable for that. He began testing drones in the mountains of southeastern Anatolia by surveilling Turkish separatist rebels. By 2015, he was ready to debut with TB2. His company had a wide demonstration and piloted a TB2 armed with laser-guided dummy bombs and successfully struck targets the size of picnic tables from 5 miles out. That marked the turning point, and soon his firm began marketing its drones worldwide, where they developed a reputation for reliability, technical innovation, and cost effectiveness. The Turkish government as well invested hundreds of millions in Baykar and billions overall into its defense sector. And these subsidies have paid off. 3,000 defense companies in Turkey now employ 80,000 technicians and engineers. And Turkey's export earnings from weapons are projected to reach $6 billion in 2023. So, what are the implications? I think one of the questions that we're facing, especially when you look at sort of this dynamic between the West trying to control the proliferation of technology and doubling down on supply restrictions, the question of whether we're seeing the onset of new technological Cold War. Certainly, Western leaders have started to change course. Under Biden, the U.S. has ramped up its efforts to deny China industry access to advanced techs, particularly semiconductors. We talked about the October 2022 rule in the Bureau of Industry and Security and the Department of Commerce that has essentially designed the critical China's chip manufacturing capacity when it comes to leading-edge chips. And the logic behind the regulation is simple: that advanced microchips are foundational to computers, to AI systems, to sophisticated weapons and surveillance apparatuses. And to stay ahead of rivals and to maintain tech dominance in America needs to close up access to these tools. So one of the primary architects of this has been National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. And here he is in 2022, in September, right before the BIS rule came out, the SEFP, Special Competitive Studies Project Summit, talking specifically about this strategy. And there he says, if implemented correctly, export control could be a, quote, new strategic asset in the U.S., an allied toolkit to oppose costs of adversaries, and even over time, degrade radical capabilities. So Europe and Japan have soon followed suit, enacting restraints against China's tech sector. And as the West has tightened its technological controls against China, it's also implemented a similar campaign against Russia, instituting a massive sanctions program to cut off the supply of microchips and critical components. Now, the question is, what is the strategic outcome that the West seeks? Is it achievable? Is it long-term economic primacy? Is it the denial of military parity? Part of the problem here is that it's been a little bit unclear. However, I think where these trends are moving us towards, particularly in light of the dynamics that I mentioned, is towards competing spheres of technological influence. And I think what we're seeing is Europe converging more closely in line with the United States, at least when it comes to these types of export restrictions, while China is doubling down in support of Moscow, Tehran, and other authoritarian. And so, what's interesting, I think, with Europe is that you actually started to see, I think, some forward movement when it comes to high-level speeches and other types of restrictions, particularly with regard to China. So, for example, in March 2023, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, asserted that China had, quote, turned the page on terrorism, and that the CCP's overarching goal is to promote systemic change in the international order for China at its expense. And so, soon thereafter, Italy announced an intent to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, following the membership of the state. Central European countries have also pulled in the initiative due to its alignment with Moscow. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Latvia, the Czech Republic have dropped out of China's 16+1 economic cooperation initiative. And on other crucial technology issues such as semiconductor export restrictions, European countries are also falling in line behind Washington. In the meantime, what we're seeing when it comes to this kind of convergence of competing spheres of technological influence is that with Beijing's approval, Russia has tapped Hong Kong as a critical node in its export network. And since the start of the Ukraine invasion, Hong Kong has doubled its integrated circuit export to Russia to the tune of $400 million. Europe and US are increasingly locked up when it comes to imposing restrictions against not only China and Russia, but also Iran and others. And so you're seeing the sharpening lines of separation, which I think will have major effects when it comes to international cooperation, tech competition, and global stability. Now, I think another trend as well, as we're talking about sort of where these dynamics lead to, is the empowering of private companies at the expense of governments and militaries. So historically, wealthy industrialists and private companies have played a big role in foreign policy. And so, you've seen in World War I, for example, individuals like Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, supporting the Allied war efforts. Ford factories produced ships and artillery. J.P. Morgan lent England and France vast sums to cover the war expenses. John D. Rockefeller Jr. even financed elite nations. But in the digital age, I think the role of companies in geopolitics has taken on even a greater amount of prominence. And I think Elon Musk's leadership of Starlink is interesting to support, which to look at. So the Starlink system, Starlink dominates the satellite internet market. It offers capabilities that no other government or company can match at the moment. And this gives Elon Musk tremendous influence in matters of national security. I think the importance and ubiquity of Starlink's satellites in Ukraine means that Musk has final say, at least for now, over how its device will be used in the war. As one U.S. defense official has said, quote, living in the world we live in which Elon runs his company and is a private business under his control, we are living off his good graces, end quote. But the circumstances are not just limited to Starlink. And if you think about, the implications of the statement, I mean, that's a pretty significant thing coming from a senior Pentagon official to say that a private company that says we should not be in a position to dictate outcomes or to run foreign policy for the United States, let alone any other country. But companies like Cisco, Cloudflare, Google, Meta, and Microsoft are playing critical roles in putting technological infrastructure, helping countries prevent cyber attacks, protecting vulnerable data, and taking down Russian propaganda or Chinese information. And their capacities now rival those of the U.S. government. So I think this point underlies the following issue, which is that the commercialization of technology has empowered private companies at the expense of governments and militaries, and that large tech corporations have gained newfound influence previously reserved to nation states to independently shape diplomatic and military outcomes. But I also think that their increasing influence is generating pushback. I think CEOs face growing pressure, setting aside the shareholders from democratic and authoritarian governments to adhere to their respective priorities. So Moscow demands that we can cease blocking Russian state reactors. Beijing seeks assurances that Musk will not give satellite internet access to Chinese citizens. The U.S. insists that Dutch manufacturer ASML, which stop exporting EUV lithography machines, which are needed to make advanced semiconductors to China. So rising geopolitical tensions are forcing companies to navigate choppy waters in which advanced technology is treated as critical bargaining chip and limiting national security. And so I think what this is leading to is that there's a real struggle occurring right now in light of these dynamics. When it comes to the diffusion of technology, when it comes to new entrants who are asserting greater degrees of independence to push out advanced export, and when it comes to an authoritarian convergence, it's challenging the traditional dominance that the West has enjoyed for many decades. And so I think democracies in particular are really struggling to find a way to respond. And as these tools become more powerful, there's a risk that adversaries will exploit these instruments to strong arm other countries and atrocities, undermine democratically elected governments, develop powerful weapons, and obtain other geopolitical advantages. And I think the West has awakened to these threats, but I think democratic governments are struggling to figure out the best way to come up with a strategy. And I think the first instinct of American and European leaders is to attempt to control the diffusion of advanced technologies, to use regulatory and economic leverage to limit the spread of sophisticated tools to untrustworthy rivals. But I don't think this is a sustainable strategy. I think over time, drones, AI systems, autonomous weapons will be used in all corners of the world, notwithstanding the West's preferences. So I think rather than simply pursuing a strategy of export denial, Western leaders need to think more creatively about how new tools, norms, and institutions can help manage global tech competition and mitigate the geopolitical consequences. So I will stop there. Thanks for your attention and time. I look forward to your reactions, questions, and comments.
Thank you very much. In the chart that you showed of the drone exports, as you described in your presentation, the precipitous rise of Turkey is very fascinating. Also, the precipitous drop from China. What is that because of export controls, or what do you think explains that?
Yeah, I looked into that a bit, and from what I understand is that there's a drop in demand in part because of unreliability and capabilities. There's a view that, and then one of the things that's really interesting is that Turkey isn't just exporting cheap drones per se, especially the cheap platform. Alongside the actual vehicles, you also have a software packaging, kind of laser precision guided missiles and other sorts of things. So there is a level of capability that Turkey has perfected that really compares favorably to many other kind of higher end drone manufacturers. And the sense that I've picked up when it comes to Chinese drones is that there's a view that they're more cheaply made. They don't have as many of the innovative capabilities that Bayraktar drones can bring. That when it comes to kind of air flight and the ability to sort of sustain, kind of flight over a 24-hour period for ISR, intelligence, reconnaissance, and surveillance, that Chinese drones are far worse at that. So a lot of it actually, I think, comes to capabilities more than anything else.
Thanks, that was super interesting. I was just wondering if you could maybe comment a little bit about how the dynamics of movements, like say, no tech workers, so tech workers within private companies, banding together to resist the deployment of technology, militaristic settings. How that kind of resistance might be at all like shaping some things.
Yeah. I wonder if that's not a slightly outdated story. I mean, I think a lot of us, are familiar with Project Data, for example, and Google's kind of pulling out of that. And I'm not so sure that Google's leaders will make the same choices today. I certainly know that many other countries that are sort of based out of Silicon Valley have kind of formed this startup ecosystem as it relates to kind of high-tech tools, but they're very interested in peddling these types of technologies to the Pentagon and to the U.S. government. And some of them, are designed in the get-go to do so. So if you look at places like Palantir, Gandible, and a host of others, I mean, their orientation is, there's a market opportunity, there's product to be made, you don't have an ethical problem with it. This is as long as it's a democratic country, so they say, I don't know. I mean, that's the point you make. We can set that aside, for the moment. But so part of the segmentation of the market that you actually have the emergence of a group of startups that are sort of selling products that way. I think you have a second kind of residual layer of companies that in the past may have had more reluctance to partner with the U.S. government. But I think even like your Googles, I think things have changed quite a bit. I don't think it has the same, I think it's something sort of do no evil model away from their corporate model. And I think that, certainly with Google, Microsoft is a case in point where they're doing lots of things on the cybersecurity front to kind of work closely in conjunction with the U.S. government and so forth. To me, it strikes me that is a movement that is really kind of heavy, and that the kind of new mentality in Silicon Valley for a variety of reasons is to contemplate and embrace these types of partnerships. And I guess the question would be sort of like, what's the, where's the line? Is there going to be a certain point where companies sort of say, look, up until this point, we're comfortable. Beyond this point, we're not. But it seems to me that the line keeps shifting further and further out. I don't know. I'm not sure if that so much is the prevailing viewpoint, at least as a large term.
This would be, thank you again, this is fascinating. This would be too broad or technical, but I'm just generally curious, give any thoughts on like what like the legal issues in like this set of topics is. Like when I think about like these private companies that have developed these capabilities, and now like there's government and other like Western governments are wanting to ensure that like certain these technologies are used in certain ways, like are there like legal frictions between those interactions and then or others, and then are like on a global scale, is there a way in which like like, the countries that are invested in like international law which might exist are trying to like develop ways like maybe sanction a type of company that would provide technology or weapon needs to or not cooperate maybe with that democratic governments.
Yeah. That's a great question. And, I have a spectrum that I've been developing. I didn't talk about it today. I'm sort of like let's look at kind of like issues when it comes to the growing mentality when it comes to technology or the implications of policy legalized for that. I think there's sort of two kind of sets of legal issues to consider. So I think one of them is that what are the legal implications when it comes to new, more powerful emerging technologies that are getting manufactured at scale, that are coming online in the next years, that will have profound implications when it comes to, at least from a technical perspective, the rules of engagement. So, I think lethal autonomous weapons are a great case in point. And for a long time, when I was in the State Department 10 years ago, I always looked upon that as slightly speculative. The idea that still robots means something that we have to worry about, but maybe later on. And they are being used today in a Ukraine context, in many other contexts. The idea that you have an autonomous drone that loiters on the battlefield with kind of predetermined targeting parameters and then kind of strikes at those with either sort of minimal human in the loop or no human in the loop is a reality. And so that alone, I think, raises a huge question when it comes to the kind of distance between empirical observation and battlefield standards. The idea that you need to at least have eyes on the battlefield in order to know what you're striking, with this sort of now everything is sort of viewed through either a video camera or through the prism of a recommendation from AI algorithm. To me, that ushers in a ton. I mean, frankly, I think it ushers in the need for a completely new framework and agreed upon understanding about norms and conduct in terms of how these technologies are used. And I think the implications at a minimum for international humanitarian law are pretty profound. And so one of the things I've had a lot of conversations with the ICRC and others, and they've started to kind of put out norms and sort of soft law ideas with regards around digital technology and the implications for existing frameworks of civilian protection. But I can tell you it's very nascent. The most recent thing that they came out, they had a group of experts come together and they just released a few weeks ago sort of recommendations for digital technology in the battlefield. And again, this is not codified. This is not even, I mean, in terms of like force of law, it's very, it's persuasive and fairly that. And essentially just the statement principles from a formally constituted group of high level experts convened by the ICRC to lay out basic ideas for how digital technologies ought to interact with existing norms of international humanitarian law. So we're very much in the beginning phase, I think, when it comes to sort of living technologies and the legal issues that emanate from those. I think a second set of issues relates to kind of what we're seeing here, which is that if manufacturers coming out of liberal democracies have a set of standards either based in domestic law or even based out of kind of arrangements like the Boston arrangement that they tend to conform to as it relates to customers and the obligations they have to do due diligence and vetting of human rights abuses. Those same restrictions do not at all apply or not all adhered to when it comes to some of the newer entrants. So again, I focus a lot on Israel, Turkey, and Iran as case in point, because all three of them, I break this down in my article, you can see very clear instances of the types of countries, many rife with human rights abuses, who are acquiring these technologies and the lack of controls therein, and the abuses that have in fact been observed and recorded using those same technologies. So I think a second order question is, what about those countries that are kind of more recently emerging with these technologies? And what are the kind of legal rules that either they are obligated to adhere to, or that in the future countries will impose on them, given the prevalence of the technologies that they're exporting?
Why do we find all five countries concentrate in the number of exporting? For example, in 2016, the number of exporting in very low level. In 2018, all in very high level. And who are the countries?
Yeah, and I actually do break down all the data in the article with forthcoming. So I will make sure to pass that along to you. But I think it's what's really interesting. What I do, and I don't have it like right in front of me right here, but what I do is I break down in the chart all the different purchasing governments of these things. Right? And that was very much my own question. And I think what was interesting is that each one of these three countries exports to a slightly different type of customer. So with Iran, they really are exporting to countries that otherwise would have very little access to these types of drones because of sanctions or other such things. Russia, for example, is a customer. Other countries along similar lines end up being customers for Iranian drones. For Turkey, they tend to be customers that have human rights abuses. They have other alternatives. So they're not completely, and they're not sanctioned out, but they still have a high hurdle, and Pakistan is a case in point, Ethiopia is another case in point, when it comes to accessing these drones from Western manufacturers who have higher levels of tools. And then Israel tends to kind of go slightly higher end in the market, but there's an overlap with Turkey as well. So Azerbaijan is a good case in point where Azerbaijan is both 2020 and then most recently 2023 when it was fighting against Armenian separatists in Nagorno-Karabakh, used a combination of Israeli Arab drones and TB2s in order to decisively defeat our Armenian soldiers. And that's where you actually see an overlap in Turkey Israel. So there really is kind of an interesting grouping when it comes to the type of clients who are accessing different drone products for those three different countries. In terms of the up and down here, I mean, I think that part of this is also due to just the way in which orders come. So, for example, if you have 1 year where you have one country making a very high level of 50 drones, they're not gonna the next year also put in place a similar order. So you're gonna have a little bit of variance up and down, but I think if you kind of draw a line that the overall trend does show that there is an increasing level of market penetration when it comes to Turkey and some of the other countries.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate how you've laid everything out in a very clear and understandable way, very approachable. There are a few comments I'd like to make and get your responses on. Hopefully push you a little bit. So you present the rise of technology through commercial orgs, right? And the commercial orgs are driven by VCs, and in order to maximize your profit, you want to be in as many countries as possible. And so it creates this conflict, right? That you sort of nicely pointed out. But it several times in how you phrased it, it's almost like a surprise. Maybe you're just being purposely neutral, which is fine. But obviously this didn't happen by accident, right? Weapons manufacturers in the 50s, right, in the US were talking about doing precisely the kinds of things that happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s and the present day, right? So it's not that the government suddenly found itself, the military, et cetera, suddenly found itself unable to compete technologically with Googles and whatnot, right? In fact, from senators on down, went out of their way to try to ensure that companies could, in fact, produce these things, right? And there's a bunch of ideological reasons for that. But I'm curious to know if not treating this as a surprise might change sort of some of the arguments you're making here. The other point that I want to make just very quickly and get your perspective on is I have a sort of a concern that you're overvaluing high tech as a form of power projection, right? I mean, there's more computing power in this than in all 3 redundant computers on the space shuttle, right? All I need is I don't even need an iPhone, right? I can get a cheap $300 phone to build a drone. If I can put a camera on it, it's another, $100 or something. I don't even need a computer, right? I can just do most of it in short term, right? And I understand long projection, et cetera. You need the bit. I get all of it, right? But how would you respond to a person saying, well, actually, in terms of power projection, both on the military battlefield and even metaphorically, high tech doesn't necessarily mean that much, right? Exporting chips, right? If we stop exporting chips, the U.S., right? What it just does is allows China, Russia, other countries to build up their own chip infrastructure. And we don't need a chip, a 3 nanometer process or whatever, right? We can be perfectly fine using chips from 30 years ago to fly drones. So you see what I'm saying? So I'm suggesting what I think some people might push back on some of the arguments you're making. And I think you probably have really interesting responses. So I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think those are all both good points. So let's talk about the kind of commercialization question. I guess in some way I sort of set it up as a surprise as a way to kind of narratively help to kind of sharpen argument. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, these are we put in place certain types of policies, particularly after the Cold War, to kind of offload innovation, and then you allow sort of capital flows to come from sectors other than the public. And what do you think the effect would be? I think it's one of those things where there wasn't a lot of long-term thinking when it came to making those choices. That I think they were made seemingly, with the idea that one, we were going to have a certain era of passing our map. We no longer had to worry about strategic rivals. And if you think about it, in the sort of 1990s, I mean that truly seemed to be the case. And so we made a lot of bad decisions with unanticipated consequences. And I think that certainly was one of those. And I think maybe we also didn't quite realize just how prevalent and critical some of these components, the idea that you project in the 1990s that somehow satellite internet technology with low Earth orbiting satellites would become such an integral part of Ukraine's ability to push back against Russia. Well, first we have to understand the extent to which internet communications was something that would be critical about. Then you have to sort of think about the way network technologies have evolved beyond kind of prior points. And so it took a lot of different kind of projections to kind of understand that, but I think the bottom line is that structurally, we moved, I mean, and it wasn't even so much that we moved different companies, it's that these sources of funding started moving from the public sector to the private sector, and that shift led to new incentives for that both meant less control in terms of what the government wanted, but also it meant a kind of diffusion of interest when it came to what companies would innovate products for. So that's kind of how I would look upon that, but I think the point is well taken. And then the other question, you know, in terms of like are we overvaluing the role of high technology? I mean, I kind of make both arguments to some degree, right? Because one of my arguments is essentially that you can't stop it, diffusion is occurring anyway, and adaptation, in fact, the chapter I'm kind of thinking about that looks at adaptation in the Ukraine context and maybe even in the Gaza conflict, the adaptation from lower resource but innovative actors can overcome larger states with high technology. And so I do think that's an important part of the story. There's some really good research out there. I like Audrey Cronin, she's now at Carnegie Endowment, her book, Power to People, came out a couple of years ago, really goes into that quite a bit and looks at kind of terrorist groups, ISIS and others, and their ability to kind of take advantage of the commercialization revolution to innovate beyond kind of large powers. I think that's all really important, but I do think that a second part of the story is that there is a policy of control and a strategic logic to maintaining privacy in the highest technologies, whether or not that is something that makes sense or not, that is kind of being led at the very highest levels in capitals in Europe and the United States, right? And the reason I put up that slide, Jake Sullivan, is to really accentuate the point is that, and again, I think part of the book, honestly, is to sort of say you have policy control, it's not going to work, but there it is, and it's something that the U.S. government is committed to. And it's committed to whether or not it actually ends up perversely incentivizing Chinese industry to manufacture catch up on semiconductors in the long run. I think it's a fair question to ask, and that sort of conflict or that tension is part of what I want.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very thought-provoking. So one thread of the presentation was that, look, these people who have very little firepower, but with some expertise can take on people who have a lot of firepower. The little guy with some technology or something. I want to ask you whether there's something new about that in this particular context. So a petty thief or petty vandalism can do vandalism where, you know, it's much harder to prevent, you know, somebody breaking a window than if everybody has a hammer in their house, right? In cybersecurity also, this is like a really known phenomenon, like since ages ago. Like somebody can, you know, just unleash a virus or malware and like cause massive destruction. It requires a lot, you know, more sort of preparation or defense to prevent that or to minimize the harms or, you know, respond to it. But is there something that's new here? I mean, should we think about this as a unique situation in the case of those and more power, or is it an instance of this wider phenomenon?
Well, I think so. I think it's really not. And so, you know, I would look at it in a couple of ways. So I think in terms of what's not new, well, I think there's sort of a kind of dominant opinion that consistently overlooks the fact that technologies and resource asymmetries can be made up, right? And so I think this is something that constantly needs to be reminded every time a larger power or more technologically sophisticated power is surprised by the fact that a seemingly less resourced, less advanced adversary is able to attain a victory. There's sort of a need to sort of say, well, look, I mean, historically that has been the case, and that's something that you should all pay attention to. With the Gaza conflict being, I think, the most recent example of that, of a much less resourced adversary being able to overcome highly sophisticated surveillance towers using innovative means in which to do so, right? I think on the other hand, you know, over time, you know, what tends to happen is that these kind of quick wins, these adaptive capabilities tend not to prevail. And so if you look at ISIS, for example, which pioneered all sorts of things from using social media in insidious ways to promote and mobilize followers around the world, the type of kind of suicide strikes and bombings that it pioneered. Ultimately, where is ISIS today? You know, what is its geopolitical heft today? And so even if there is a lesson in terms of small overcoming big, in the long term, it hasn't been able to kind of sustain an edge. But I do think then what we're seeing in Ukraine is something slightly different. I mean, in part, I mean, it is kind of morphing into a more traditional type of battle in terms of French warfare and whatnot. But I think that the ability to kind of change around tactics and to show how network communications can really make a difference in contrast to kind of just massive amounts of firepower, I think is showcasing innovative ways that technology can help smaller players outclass over a longer period of time, larger, less innovative, more lumbering, more platform centric large entities. So I think there is a lesson there to think about.
I know this isn't part of your main thesis, but I think look at a lot of particularly state in terms of the tech that it expects. But I remember that there was concern raised at one point about Facebook being potentially infiltrated by people that are acting on behalf of other states, but like engineers within Facebook. Where would you say that that fits within this like geopolitical dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, one thing certainly I think with Elon Musk is that there are intent issues, right? So we're not talking about infiltration, mentioning, but we are talking about this conflict of interest. And so, for example, the classic example we give with Starlink is that, obviously there's a lot of, he faces a lot of pressure from all the developers, which is providing capability. What happens if there's a potential invasion of Taiwan, given the kind of large stake its holdings in Tesla have, in fact, they have a company, a factory in China, to what extent would he be willing to provide Starlink terminals in light of facing kind of massive financial ruin? And so that's where you have a problem with transnational corporations, is that they can be unreliable players, particularly if they're not kind of your traditional military contractors. I mean, Starlink wasn't set up for that. It was set up transnational. And so with geopolitics, it's the kind of revenue objectives of these companies. Oftentimes you can make sharp trade-offs. I'll give you a few other examples of that as well. I've had a series of conversations with business leaders in companies like Microsoft and Google regarding their involvement in the Ukraine crisis. And one of the things that was really kind of stuck out to me was the fact that Google has really gone all in to the point where they even received like a Hero of Ukraine award for their work in providing cybersecurity and teleporting data from physical data centers in Ukraine into the cloud, right? And they've been very open about it. They kind of trumped that and they put that out. But again, they can afford to do so because Russia is a minor market. And essentially their bet is the reputational benefits that they would get from aligning with the West, from US interests, versus and withdrawing from the Russian market will more than make up the loss of revenue from Moscow. But what happens when you have, again, whether it's a conflict with China or something else, where it's not nearly as clear when it comes to revenue projections, whether aligning with the United States or so forth is as good as that. Now probably because they're in the US anyway, it becomes a new issue, but I still think it raises really interesting questions. And what we do see is we see a lot of compromises, particularly when individual states have strong interests in seeing a policy go, and democratic states have a very diffuse set of interests in seeing those policies stop. So a good example is Vietnam, where Facebook has routinely, and this is reported in the Washington Post, routinely pulled down content and provided information about the users to the Vietnamese government upon request, because the Vietnamese government, is very interested in high interest in sort of getting this information to Facebook. In the United States and others just don't care. And so this asymmetry of interest means that ultimately, kind of what you're mentioning is that Facebook just accede to those requests, which it does. And you see that in many other markets as well. India is a good case in point. Turkey is another good case in point, where the high asymmetric interests of a authoritarian leading state or a liberal democratic state exceeds those of liberal democracies. Therefore, the companies find themselves giving in, even if it goes against kind of broader ethical principles they profess to adhere to.
More questions, we have time.
So, so in this talk, I have heard of different technologies that are both material and immaterial, right? When we talk about AI, for example, and drones, right? There is a material aspect to it, and AI, which is about information. Could you like distinguish between how the material aspect that tend to spread more widely and faster can affect like kind of geopolitics as opposed to the material production, which is requires different kind of infrastructure to make happen, especially in the age where we're talking about kind of AI systems that are made to be general and made to be kind of universal, and then different parties can take that and then fine tune it for their own purposes, which makes it like easier to spread as opposed to building drones, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point. I think it's something that I thought about in some of its hardware versus software. A lot of these systems, drones, especially military grade drones, have less of a dual use purpose. Although commercial grade drones, consumer drones, which actually have really sort of taken off when it comes to their use, is something where you really do have a person very easy to use and move. I mean, I think that's something where, it's really interesting because there are all sorts of things. Let's take something like large language models. There are all sorts of questions about to what extent is that are those capabilities something that can be repurposed and you can build applications that can go towards various aims. And I think whether it comes to it's hard to build a large language model, but it's getting easier. It's not very hard to kind of build an application to use against one, particularly one that's somewhat open. And so I do think this general idea of fusion, whether it's military grade drones, which we are seeing use and are becoming increasingly cheaper and easier to make, whether it's commercial drones, whether it's other types of high technology, I think there's a general push and a trend of fusion. And I think that's something that's worth noting. And I think, and the reason I find this so interesting is that really we're looking at two opposite kind of trend lines. We're seeing this desire by Western liberal democracies to control as much as possible the higher order, higher end of manufacturing and even software development versus kind of this historical process of fusion that really makes it unlikely they're going to be successful in the medium to long term when it comes to kind of maintaining dominance or control over the proliferation of
Thanks for the presentation. I guess I have a more general question about sort of the kind of your kind of book project and how you're imagining this. I'm just curious who the audience is and if there's a specific kind of view that you're responding to, or if it's some kind of like just generally accepted wisdom in Washington that you think is incorrect. I guess I'm just trying to get sort of better bearing on how this relates to sort of a lot of the stuff that's come out on policy on maybe my other things on this kind of tech kind of regulation angle. Yeah,
I mean, I think and that's something I'm kind of still kind of working out. I would say that the audience is one, and I think ideally it would be one for sort of straight arm of the university press or somewhere in that kind of end where it's not. I wouldn't want it necessarily market only towards the actual community, but I would want it to be relevant to the actual community, but also I think relative to a broader either informed users or involved in kind of policy making, but aren't necessarily steeped in this specific issue, but want to understand better what these trends mean when it comes to power and geopolitics. So I think a good example of a book that I like, and mine would be a little more kind of technical. There's a recent book by Henry Farrell and Abe Newman called Underground Empire. They built by the United States as a means to kind of exert its power around the world. And, what's interesting there is that on the one hand, you can sort of say, well, I get it, of course, they're using this banking system, they're using sanctions increasingly as a means to kind of force countries, compel countries to do its bidding, and that over time, that might have unintended consequences, because the more you kind of use the tool, the more those who face the brunt of it will seek alternatives, right? So that kind of maybe it seems obvious. But on the other hand, I think tying it together into kind of into a comprehensive argument, and then applying it to ongoing policies that policymakers may not be thinking. I mean, one of the things I've learned being at one point a policymaker myself is that you're so consumed with the day-to-day, week to week. You say, how can I get this executive order out? These ethical sanctions are work. You don't step back and say, what is my theory for why I'm doing this? Where are trends going around the world, and how does this relate to that? That kind of hitting those questions is sort of the goal of this book. To force policymakers to step a little bit out of the myopia of the week to week and say, wait a second, before I embark on yet another slew of export restrictions, without sort of thinking about the consequences, let me think about the consequences. That's kind of the.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you're thinking about like what technology to even focus on, and if the purpose of the book is to go a little kind of broader and talk about the geopolitical context. I guess I'm just curious. It seems like Washington is now obsessed with AI. There's a lot of conversation with 5G. Like, are you thinking less in terms of specific applications and more just structures? Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger if you focus on applications that you could soon find yourself with an outdated book. I think looking at kind of underlying technologies that kind of have a long run. So look, I mean, looking at semiconductor restraints, for example, restrictions, and that to me represents a policy that's already in place. So critiquing that or placing it in context would be useful. Drones are again another thing that are increasingly proving to be a critical aspect of military innovation. So that makes sense, but not necessarily focusing. If I focus on particular example, so I focus on two right here. It's as a use case. It's as a case study to illustrate how this works. But I think thinking more about classes of technology, that's kind of where my head is. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for your questions. No.
Thank you. But once you got, the feedback professor